Study Session 6, International Defense Organization or Alliances, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Introduction. This study session will help you understand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and its implications for Africa. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to know what defense alliances are and their examples, what NATO is and why it was formed, the problems and prospects of NATO, and how NATO's activities affect Africa. Understanding defense alliances. Defense alliances or organizations are bodies set up to effect the military protection of a nation or group of nations in terms of international defense arrangement. Examples of defense alliances in the world today are the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, Warsaw Treaty Organization, WTO, etc. We must note, however, that at times the word alliances is taken to mean the same thing as defense alliances. For example, Edwin Freda defined alliance to be a limited set of states acting in concert at a time regarding the mutual enhancement of the military security of members. Defense alliances offer opportunities for increasing power externally, outside national power. Thus, nations may conclude new alliances that are either purely temporary or that may become long-term commitments, as in NATO and WTO. These alliances are merely intergovernmental and not supranational organizations, as member states retain their full sovereignty and independence. Despite this, it has always been dominated by the United States. The NATO, which have been described as the most stable and cohesive of all known political military alliances in the world today, are concerned in this lecture and the subsequent one. The formation of NATO. The NATO, which provides a sort of collective security arrangement and has its mutual defense pact roughly restricted to a prescribed geographical area covering the North America, Western Europe, the North Atlantic, and most of the northern and part of southern shores of the northern Mediterranean, was founded on the 4th of April 1949 as a counterforce to Soviet expansionism and threats in Europe after the Second World War. It emerged from the linking of the Brussels Alliance of Western Europe and the Inter-American Treaties of Reciprocal Association, that is the Rio Pact. The North Atlantic Treaty, which created NATO as an alliance of free nations for collective self-defense as defined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, was originally signed by the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European countries, namely Belgium, Britain, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, and Portugal in Washington, D.C. Greece and Turkey joined in 1952, while Federal Republic of Germany and Spain joined in 1955 and 1982 respectively. The Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland joined NATO in 1999. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Romania became members of NATO in 2004. Croatia and Albania joined NATO in 2009. The alliance is currently made up of 28 alliance members. However, because of President Charles de Gaulle's announcement in March 1966, which formally pulled out France from NATO's military side because of France's suspicion of the way NATO was heading and had been critical of the so-called reliance in the United States, there are 15 full members. This does not mean that France is totally out of NATO, as it is still an active and equal member of the political alliance. Today, the activities of the alliance have increased to meet up with the challenges of the 21st century. The alliance reviewed its policies and programs in order to promote cooperation with Russia, Ukraine, and other countries outside the NATO, and entering into partnership with other international organizations, specifically the European Union, United Nations, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, with the goal of improving military capabilities. For instance, in 1999, it established a Defense Capabilities Initiative to improve military capabilities in the rapidly changing security environment. Consequently, in 2000, the Alliance established a Weapons of Mass Destruction Center in order to tactically confront the new security challenges such as international terrorism and proliferations of weapons of mass destruction. In the center, allies share information about threats and prefer a corresponding response, and the creation of European security and defense identity aimed to help members become more responsible in security and defense field. Furthermore, following the 9/11 terrorist attack on the United States, NATO embarked on more reforms and initiatives, which was endorsed by members in November 2002 at the Prague Summit. This followed the support provided by 14 alliance members for the US-led operation against Al-Qaeda terrorist network and the Taliban. In March 2011, NATO led all military operations in Libya and supported insurgents for the ousting of tyrannical government of Muammar Gaddafi, in line with the United Nations Security Council resolutions. NATO and its partners began by enforcing arms embargo and a no-fly zone, and pursued all means necessary to ensure that civilians and civilian-populated areas are protected from attack or threat of attack. Principles and aims of NATO. NATO has both political and military tasks. Hence, it is not correct to see it as purely a military organization. However, the military role has been recognized as primary. The political task, which is however related to the military aspects, is to provide for consultation on political problems of relevance to its members or to the alliance, and to give direction to the military side of the organization. The ultimate political purpose of the alliance includes: 1. To achieve a lasting peaceful order accompanied by appropriate security guarantees. 2. To guarantee the security of its members. 3. To foster stable international relations, especially with respect to the promotion of stability and cooperation throughout Europe. The alliance is committed to protecting its members through political and military means. It promotes democratic values and is dedicated to the peaceful resolution of disputes. If diplomatic efforts fail, it has the military capability needed to undertake collective defense and crisis management operations alone or in cooperation with partner countries or international organizations. In order to achieve these aims, the alliance is guided by the salient principle enshrined in Article 5 of its charter, which entails that the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered as an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of rights of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty was invoked for the first time in September 2001, following the terrorist attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the United States. NATO members pledged to support the United States in its war against terrorism and were involved in the US-led coalition against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Other principles which the alliance are parties include: 1. To pursue international peace, security and justice. 2. To refrain from the threat or use of force in any way which will not be consistent with the purpose of the United Nations. 3. To eliminate conflict in their international economic politics and to encourage collaboration between their countries. In-text questions. Libya was a real test for the alliance. Under extremely tight timelines, NATO responded more rapidly than at any time in its history to the United Nations call to protect the people of Libya. We learned that when there is international political consensus on the need for a military response to a crisis, the militaries of NATO are ready to respond immediately and in an integrated way to achieve the mission. But we also learned that NATO could not have carried out the operations without the unique capabilities the United States can provide, such as drones or intelligence and refueling aircrafts. Such capabilities are vital for our operations. Excerpt from interview of Admiral James Stavridis, former Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. 1. The above statement by Admiral James Stavridis shows that NATO has contravened its charter and the principle on which it was established. A. True. B. False. 2. From the above passage, we can assert that the success of NATO lies in the military strength of the United States. A. True. B. False. Feedback on the in-text questions. 1. The correct answer is B. If you chose option A, then you are incorrect, because the roles of NATO in ensuring the security of its members have expanded beyond Europe, North America, and the Mediterranean to include other parts of the world which pose new security threats to members, particularly issues of terrorism and state-sponsored terrorism. Libya has long been seen as a country that sponsors terrorist groups. See the Lockerbie bombing. Moreover, the issue of protection of fundamental human rights globally has become salient among Committee of Nations and various global, regional, and sub-regional organizations, which often go into partnership in ensuring that states respect the rights of their citizens. 2. The correct answer is A. If you chose option B, then you are incorrect, because the United States military might and presence is a very important structural feature that binds the contemporary international order together. Organization structure. In line with the fact that NATO is a two-suit-fold alliance, political and military, its organization follows civil and military structures. Article 9 of the North Atlantic Treaty set up a council which is specifically empowered to set up a defense committee and such subsidiary bodies as may be necessary. So, the treaty did not set up any clear-cut and elaborate institutions. However, over the years, NATO has evolved a complex network of institutional arrangements through innovation. North Atlantic Council. The North Atlantic Council is the main political decision-making body of the alliance. The North Atlantic Council, with headquarters in Brussels, is also made up of a network of committees who maintain agenda for the alliance in areas of consultation, cooperation, and planning for multinational activities which are both military and political. It is essentially a council of member states in which all 28 members are equally represented and decisions are taken by unanimous vote. It also has representative of the military committee, that is, its chairman. The council meets at 3 levels: at the level of ministers or at the level of heads of state and government, or at permanent representatives level. At the ministerial meetings of the council, which take place once or twice a year, member states are represented by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. But since 1951, defense and economic or finance ministers may attend depending on the issue being discussed. At the permanent representatives level, that is the permanent session, ambassadors meet at least once a week. The permanent representatives of a member state are supported by national delegations located at NATO headquarters. The national delegations are composed of advisors and officials who represent their countries on committees created by the Council. The Council is chaired by the Secretary General of NATO at whatever level they meet. The Council also has a president who presides over the opening session of ministerial meeting of the Council. The presidency of the Council, an honorary position, is rotated annually by the foreign ministers of the member states in alphabetical order of member states. The Council also set up a number of committees to assist it in its work. Some of the committees which take care of certain areas of responsibility are political affairs, science, defense, review, armament, nuclear planning, civil emergency planning, air defense, crisis management, and challenges of modern societies, among others. The Defense Planning Committee is composed of representatives of members participating in NATO's integrated military structure. This body deals with matters relating to demand military policies. Like the Council, it meets at both the permanent session, that is, at the level of ambassadors, and ministerial levels. At the latter, members are represented by defense ministers. Each level of meeting is chaired by the Secretary General of NATO. International staff comprises the Office of the Secretary General and 5 major divisions: the Office of Management and Office of Financial Controller. These constitute a permanent secretariat for the organization. The international staff is made up of personnel from all member states and is responsible to the Secretary General. The Secretary General himself is responsible for promoting and directing the process of consultation within the alliance, among others. NATO Parliamentary Assembly, or NATO PA. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly is another political institution of the alliance that spawns political policy agenda. It comprises legislators of NATO member countries. The salient role of this institution is to evaluate security issues which affect all members. The NATO PA is an independent institution from NATO which provides relationship between the alliance of legislators of member countries in order to establish a compromise among the parliaments and the public of the decisions of the alliance. More so, NATO PA also integrates partner countries' parliamentarians into its discussions. The NATO PA meets at the annual session and one other during the year. The NATO PA sets political policy agenda for the NATO Council via reports of its 5 committees: Committee on the Civil Dimension of Security, Defense and Security Committee, Economic and Security Committee, Political Committee, Science and Technology Committee. Military structure. The military structure consists of the Military Committee, the International Military Staff, and the NATO commands. The Military Committee is the highest military authority in the alliance and the oldest permanent organ in NATO after the North Atlantic Council. This body meets at least twice a year or whenever it's deemed necessary. Until 2008, France was part of the Military Committee as a result of the country's 1966 decision to extricate itself from NATO's integrated military structure. However, France rejoined in 1995. Until France rejoined NATO, it was not represented on the Defense Planning Committee, which led to conflicts between it and NATO members. The Military Committee is responsible for making recommendations to the Council and Nuclear Planning Group on those matters considered necessary for the common defense of NATO area. It also advises the 2 strategic commanders, that is, the Allied Command Operations, responsible for strategic, operational, and tactical management of combat and combat support forces of the NATO members, and the Allied Command Transformation Organization, responsible for the induction of the new member states' forces into NATO and NATO forces' research and training capability by helping them in the development of all-inclusive strategic policy. Thus, the Military Committee is an important nexus between the political decision-making process and the NATO military structure. The chairman of the committee is rotated annually among the nations in order of English alphabetical order. The chairman is elected by the Chief of Staff for a 3-year term. The NATO commands. The strategic area of NATO is divided into 3 commands, namely Allied Command Europe, otherwise known as ACE, headed by the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, SACEUR. Allied Command Atlantic, under the Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, and Allied Command Channel, headed by the Allied Command Chief Channel. Each command is divided into sub-commands subordinate to the Supreme Allied Commander for effectiveness. Problems and prospects. Some of the problems of NATO can be itemized thus. A. Considerable cultural challenges exist among the alliance's new members in relation to roles that each has played in former regional and world powers. These challenges include often conflicting attitudes between East and West Europeans, public trust of the military and traditional roles of the military. B. Institutional challenges arguably pose the greatest difficulty. New members have limited military budget, and the existence of corruption in the control of the military which impedes on its effectiveness. New members have limited military budgets, and the existence of corruption in the control of the military which impedes on its effectiveness. Problems of standardization and control of weapons. There is always a competition between the United States and their European counterparts, example, France. This necessarily breeds rivalry. This is apart from conflicts arising from the will of each state. Example, France to develop its nuclear strategy independent of the US. D. Problem arising from political prestige. Who is to command what and how? This partly explains France's position in the alliance. She detests United States domination. E. Military logistical problems. How to coordinate effectively when all the thousands of supply items are entirely different from each army. Thus, the multiplicity of sources and types of weapons in NATO is a problem. F. The control of nuclear weapons has been one of the most persistent sources of conflict within NATO, particularly between the United States and her European allies. And G. Lack of concurrence on certain issues. Example, NATO countries have different opinions on the relation between the Western powers and Cuba, and in areas such as Vietnam's attempt at membership of the United Nations. In spite of the above problems, NATO had remained intact, and America, as the dominant force in NATO, has retained almost total control over the use and development of NATO arsenals. In both the United States and NATO countries, there exist powerful forces, especially a powerful industrial establishment, manipulating the popular will and buffering national policy in support of the alliance. Also, The relative stability and cohesion in NATO, as in Warsaw Treaty Organization, have been attributed to the convergence of the ideological preferences of members and the fear of contending ideology and the existence of formalized relations through institutional structures, among others. NATO and Africa. Although NATO is a defense alliance of the West, its activities, however, affect Africa directly or indirectly. The basic reason for this is Africa's weakness and dependency in all ramifications. Another reason is NATO's historical mission as a counterforce to the Warsaw Treaty Organization, which makes Africa, because of its strategic importance, a major focus for East-West strategic competition. So, NATO looks upon Africa as a launching pad and a major military strategic region, which attracts it also from the military and economic point of view. The reasons above, among others, have made Africa a focus of strategic rivalry between East and West. Hence, ideological rivalry, reminiscence of the Cold War, is shifted to Africa. Since the early 1950s, the United States and the Western European colonial powers had constructed bases of varying sizes as useful backup assets for the NATO. For example, in the early 1950s, the United States constructed 4 air bases in Morocco and built a strategic base in Libya and a substantial communication and electronic interest station in Ethiopia. In Kenya, Somalia, and Egypt, among others, were US bases. More importantly, Portugal did not only deny her territories in Africa independence, it made it clear that it expected NATO alliances at least to tolerate its policies in exchange for leasing to the United States substantial naval and air facilities, or the Azores Island, which later served as critical point for resupplying Israel during the 1967 and 1973 wars in the Middle East. Furthermore, it could be argued that NATO has been pro-imperialism and unduly involves itself in internal affairs of African states. For example, during the Shaba insurrection in 1977, NATO openly mustered support directly and indirectly for the insurgents. France, Belgium, Britain, and the United States were directly involved. In fact, they restored to the myth of communist menace and a threat to Africa and alleged that the Zaire problem was inspired by Cuba and the Soviet Union. In recent years, NATO continued to permeate the African continent. Between 2005 and 2007, NATO airlifted over 30,000 African Union troops to the Darfur region of Western Sudan, and ever since, it brought in thousands of Ugandan and Burundian forces into the Somali capital of Mogadishu for combat operations in order to provide support for the sequestered and ostensible transitional federal government. Furthermore, in 2008, NATO established a permanent naval presence off the Horn of Africa in the Gulf of Aden and the Arabian Sea with Operation Allied Provider, Operation Allied Protector, and since 2009 and into the indefinite future, Operation Ocean Shield. The role of the permanent naval presence was felt when NATO enforced the United Nations Security Council Resolution passed in December 2009, with China abstaining and Libya, by intercepting a vessel allegedly bringing weapons to Eritrea as part of operations to enforce a naval blockade against the country. Also, NATO, in collaboration with AFRICOM, assists and supervises African Standby Force Brigade, now operational in East and West Africa and planned for North, South and Center of the continent. Similarly, NATO and the African Union entered into partnership, particularly in areas of staff support and training. Joint Command Lisbon is the operational lead for NATO-AU engagement and has a senior military liaison officer at the AU headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. NATO also supports staff capacity building through the provision of places in NATO training courses to AU staff supporting AMISOM, that is, African Union Mission in Somalia, and support to operationalization of the African Standby Force, the African Union's vision for a continental on-call security apparatus similar to NATO Response Force. NATO has also been collaborating with African regional organizations in Africa, such as Economic Community of West African States, Economic Community of Central African States, the East African Standby Force, to plan interoperability testing of communications and information systems. However, all these pose major problems to a certain extent in Africa. This is because NATO, which provides a forum for the conduct of arms race in Europe, causes inter-African states conflict and rivalry, which in some cases involve the military, while NATO and Warsaw members only do ideology disputation. Also, arms race in Africa, and in fact, the existence of defense alliances like NATO, diverts economic resources away from developmental purposes or directly to needed resources required to solve complex socio-economic problems. In conclusion, the effect of NATO on Africa is that in event of superpower crisis, and given the fact that Africa is regarded as a launching pad to the West because of our strategic locations, Africa would be in immediate danger. Study session summary. In this study session, you learnt that defense alliance normally consists of independent states with the main objective of enhancing their military security. We also learnt that NATO was created on the 4th of April 1949 by the linking together of the Brussels Alliance on West Defense Union in Western Europe and the Inter-American Treaties of Reciprocal Association against the threat posed by Soviet Union in Europe after the Second World War. NATO has both political and military tasks. NATO's organizational setup is complex. It has both the civil and military structures. The civil structure consists of a council, defense planning committee, and a number of committees and international staff. The military structure has the military committee, the international military staff, and the NATO commands. We also learnt that NATO, like any international organization, is faced with many problems. These include differing loyalties and varying economic and political systems in member states, the problem of standardization, military logistical problems, and lack of concurrence on certain issues among members. Nations' operational strategies and activities have negative effects on Africa as it shifts the East-West ideological conflicts to Africa, apart from stifling Africa's socio-economic development. End of study session 6. Thanks for listening.